Good evening and welcome. Welcome to the Royal Institution, where we're holding the RA School's annual lecture. I'm Eileen Cooper, Keeper of the Royal Academy. The RA School's public programme is supported by the David Lean Foundation, and I want to specially thank Anthony Reeve, who is in the audience tonight, for making it possible. Thank you. I would like to congratulate Olafur on becoming an honorary Royal Academician. And he will be signing copies of his book, produced by Thames and Hudson, published by Thames and Hudson even, after this event. And for now, over to Tim Marlow, head of our artistic programme at the RA.
Thank you, Ali. I'm not giving away secrets, but it's great to be able to write down for Olafur what he is actually, an academician, an honorary academician. Olafur, you have worked across a whole range of different media. I think probably in more continents than any artist living, because you've worked in the Arctic Circle and Antarctica, I think, or you made work relating to that anyway. You have shown in Biennales, including Venice, you've shown in Documenta, you've shown in the Turbine Hall. So it's a career that is already, as you approach your 50th birthday, in a sense, you could say that there are 4 or 5 successful careers already realised. I just wanted to go back, because of the stress around the schools here and emerging artists and people who are at the beginning of their careers, and ask, was there a moment or a period in your very young life when it became clear to you that being an artist was an option, or was it a much slower evolution?
So no,
that's meant to be an introduction as well.
No, it's exciting. I'm so thankful for being able to be in such a lovely and legacy-driven room with all of you. Thank you for having me. I tried to ask coming in if I could buy the ticket from somebody. Nobody obviously knew that it was me, and nobody actually wanted to sell me that ticket. Yeah. So thank you for not selling me your ticket. Oh, but Tim, it's so exciting to be here. You know, it's actually, I mean, it's not, and it's particularly exciting to be in a sort of educational environment, right? Because clearly cultural education is also struggling to find its feet somehow, right? I mean, not that this place is struggling. Well, it is a little bit, I guess, but you know, so it's just, I'm just so honored to be here. So I actually forgot your question, Tim, but I'll answer. No,
it was classic deflection. It was about when the moment you became aware that being an artist was an option. I mean, I know your father was a painter, who painted it anyway, and so you used to go out. Was that the moment, or was it at art school?
No, it actually, when I was a child, see, now I'll start with something very personal, and normally I don't talk about myself because it's not really any of your business, because I don't think art, in my case, art is not really about me. But I'll just give you a small sort of personal sort of touch tonight, right? So that is, my father and mother divorced, and my father was an artist, and my mother and I lived together as things goes. And then, you know, I saw my father every once in a while, and I thought, oh, bloody hell, my father is an artist. I better learn to draw so that he would love me. So in the complexity of real life, I got very good at drawing very early. So I wonder whether that is now a good or a bad thing. Somehow it turned out to be a good thing in the long run, but it was a little more complex growing up as a child and so on and so forth. And I think it's good to be honest about it, that things that are great also sometimes grow out of things that are not so great. But essentially, what I learned was one important thing, and that was self-confidence. And luckily, I was in a situation where my parents somehow encouraged it, you know, and I would come, you know, with a sort of weekend train to the city with a stack of drawings under my arm, and my father would sort of look at them and say, a little more red on the left side, maybe, and I was like, oh, yes. So that's kind of how it started. So I wanted to become an artist from before I could almost speak. And how sad is that, quite frankly, right? So listen, but, still, then I became, sort of a teenager and puberty and so on. And then, of course, I did not want to become an artist. And I realized that one could dance. I had a little touch with a sort of dance. That was now the early 80s, which were all about sort of breakdancing and robots and so on. And my mother and I, we were living on the countryside, and I was typically sent off to Iceland over the summer so that my mother, who was like so young, could have a little bit of time without me. And essentially, so I was like walking around on the countryside in Denmark. You have to see like a bloody robot. So, and my mother, she was like, and listen, she still did not think that I was crazy. Right? So somehow I grew up in an environment where my parents, they trusted me to do something brilliant. And that, I think, is maybe the lesson that I learned, that to encourage the kind of non-quantifiable nature of what a child does is actually something that takes a little bit of courage. So my parents were very young when they had me, and to have the courage to say to your child, just keep doing this nonsense, is actually very brave. And that's how I came to trust, or sort of treasure them later on, because obviously earlier I thought they were really rubbish, as one does, right? Very unthankful and all of that. But still, I mean, it really meant something to start out with that kind of gravitational feeling that you are actually okay.
You were national champion, breakdance champion, weren't you?
Oh, but yeah, but it doesn't really matter, because it doesn't really count.
Well, it does. There's a flaw here. I think we'd be very happy if you
No, but it doesn't really count, because it was before, so I was what you call an early adopter. Not that I just had no identity, right? So suddenly I hit puberty, living on the countryside, blah, blah, blah. So suddenly I see this one person in some sort of shopping window from America in Denmark, and he was moving like a robot. So I went back into the countryside, and I could not take a glass of milk out of the fridge without doing it like a robot. And it was lovely, because I suddenly realized who I wanted to be. I wanted to be Mr. Robot. And this was then just a year or two before this, I mean, you're also young. You're either kind of too young or too old, I can tell. But anyway, the kind of situation was that then a few years after, there was all these great, legacies like Rocksteady Crew and African Bambata and Sugar Hill Gang. And suddenly you had that sort of robot and electric boogie thing going on. And by then, I was already not so bad, right? But I was like the only guy in the local sort of pub. Who was like doing the robot thing, and everybody said, "Oh, did you see that in the television?" Back then there was no, anyway, everything was different. So robot, me, and then suddenly. But the thing is, what one learns, I think, is really can be boiled down to two things. You learn when you dance that you have a body. It's wonderful, right? So you, as being a teenager, imagine what a luxury is that, to be a teenager and realize, oh, I have limbs. I have limbs. But look at the teenagers today. Man. It's like clearly they don't know that they, somehow they are either too exposed or not exposed at all, or it's all somehow seems to be very out of any, it's totally, what do you call it? Like physically disconnected. Of course, it's just me being some old bugger trying to. But that was the one thing. But the other thing is, once you dance, and it doesn't really matter whether it's robots or whatever, ballet or something, right? Once you dance, you actually realize, oh, the distance, to that over there and from here to here is roughly so and so big. It's going to take me 2 seconds, 5 seconds. I can do 2 turns. So physically, you can look at a space and you can tell how many bodies, how long time. So you get good at understanding space from a more physical perspective.
Which is a very direct relationship to your work. I mean, you could call it phenomenological, but it is always said that the link between the disparate body of work that you've produced is spatial obsession and corporeal, visceral, physical experience.
Yeah, well put. Great. Cheers. No, so and quite frankly, I mean, so the whole point is, how do we take something which is really abstract, right? Space, like space. So, and then you go like, how do I embody the space? And the space in it as of itself, of course, has a kind of built-in intentionality like this space, right? So it's a very heavy for me, very easy for you. So clearly, every space is also acting out of, intentions, right? And if one starts to physically translate that, and that could be into dance, it could also be into sculptures, could it be into movement, could it also be into sound or poetry, literature. So I'm very interested in this kind of, well, how does a space actually feel once we try to locate it within our, it's not just our body, but within our sort of sensory portfolio, or, and in that way, the dance or the sort of obsessive nature with moving, it was interesting. So at some point later on, I became very interested in dancing specialists who, in order to avoid the kind of trajectory of dance, became like, they call themselves movement specialists. So there was like a political or some kind of discursive idea. And most recently, for the Manchester Festival, MIF did the collaboration with Jamie XX and the great Wayne McGregor. And Wayne is obviously a school of his own and an amazing protagonist, and Jamie is like totally amazing, sort of more contemporary or sort of more pop type of music. It was so interesting for me to kind of reconnect with that. It was just like truly inspiring.
Do you, broadly speaking, when you create a large-scale structure, do you have a sense of choreography as to how the viewer, the visitor, may pass through it? Or are you less interested in controlling that? It's something you'll observe later?
Oh, well, thank you for asking, Tim. No, but I'm quite sure. I'm maybe, there's a whole sequence of sort of great experiential experiments one can do. So for instance, does the space when walking through it actually celebrate your movement, or does it try to alienate the fact that you moved? Oh, bloody hell, stand still. So you have kind of different architectural stereotypes, such neoclassical. Don't move out of the perspective, hierarchically optimized, perfect, for men typically type of position in which you can see and experience the perfect godlike situation, right? Or is the more transformative and transitional and so on and so forth. And architecture history and spatial history has added a lot of lovely complexity to that. Should one walk around Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona pavilion like Maholinaz proposed in order to fully understand it as a kind of temporal exercise, or should one actually look at it in the sort of more commodified version of Mies, where the 90-degree photographic sort of architecture digestive magazine sort of documentation of investor-friendly rendering of our reality, blah, blah, blah. So there's all these discourses, right? Some of which leans back into how Muybridge and photography and body and how Rodin, what's his name? Rodin, it's not British, right? The other guy.
Well, the painter or the sculptor, you mean Rodin?
Yeah, sculptor, yeah. So anyway, so 2 dimensions up against the wall, or 3 dimensions in the room, right? So le homme qui marche, so the walking guy, in English. So that means that a sculpture where all the kind of moving postures are connected in one, so that walking around the sculpture and the little celebration of temporality that somehow allows for is a way of depicting time where the temporal dimension is within the position of the viewer. So I, as the viewer, own temporality, right? I am the producer of Rodin. Unlike Muybridge, who catered for the more algebraic regime, where let me show you what time looks like, you stupid viewer, passive consumer, right? So Rodin proposed to us that the viewer is in fact a producer, whereas Muybridge proposed to us that the viewer is a consumer. So it's 2 different, ideologically speaking, positions where we, I think, today need to make up our mind. What do we want to be, Tim? Do we want to be producers, or do we want to be consumers?
Why can't we be both?
I think it's a little more complex than that. I mean, the thing is, we talk about creativity being a force that is to be integrated into the greater society if it should not totally fall into the hands of the art market, right? So what do we then do? Do we exercise trust to the people who are involved with art, or do we objectify them into passive consumers, a little bit like the ones who goes to Harvey Nichols, right? So where are we, and what confidence do we have in culture being able to shape our society? Who defines what we, I mean us, like we, what is we-ness tomorrow? If the cultural sector won't sort of celebrate we-ness and actually reinvent it, who will? Certainly not Harvey Nichols, because Harvey Nichols is not about me, no, about we, it's about me. And nothing against Harvey Nichols, just came to my mind. But you know what I mean?
All right. This is, I think, behind closed doors, although it's being
No, but
screened.
I'm actually being very sincere. I think we should not make the mistake underestimating the muscle that culture. And I say culture because I think art is, one. I think the most interesting fraction. But culture is really also, everything. Really. I was like kind of even the. Should I say the shape of the language we speak? But so it's like poetry, literature, dance, and music, and so on. But it's really. And I like this idea that people come into a museum or an institution like the one in which we are now to take a closer look at reality rather than some escapistic sort of, finally I'm a little bit away from the world, dreaming in some kind of wellness.
Spa, yeah.
Yeah, some spa, yeah, well put. Yeah, bloody hell.
No, but I think it's a very interesting point that art, I mean, the notion that art is detached from reality rather than is a heightened version of it is a kind of cliche, and I think an erroneous one. But the art world broadly often perpetuates the myth of otherness and transcendence and so on. I like the idea that the cultural sector should take a creative leadership in the world, but call me a cynic, but is that possible in the way that our political systems are set up? Is that possible in late global capitalism, free market capitalism? Or does it not matter? We should be fighting it anyway. I mean, do you still believe in that utopian idea that culture can change the world?
Yeah, it's funny. I was at the BBC and they asked the same question, and that seems such a British thing to ask, right? Do I still believe? It's like all the rest of the world thinks that, it's like beyond discussion. It's like, why would you even ask the question? So it's also because people here in Britain mistake, and that's a question of mismanagement from the cultural protagonist. They mistake the Frieze Art Fair for an art show. Right? People go there they think they go to a bloody museum, and they don't. And that's because British art, the Frieze Art Fair promoted themselves being about art, which it is not. It's about commerce. And even institutions like this is trying to find its feet. Oh shit, how are we going to deal with that now? There's like kind of more people at the fucking Frieze than at the Tate Modern. How do we navigate? So I think one should not even compromise oneself to take part in that discussion. There's just Frieze Art Fair is not about it's not about art, end of discussion, the way I see it. So, yes, I actually think that the language that we hold in our hand and that we touch each other with and other people with, and we are being touched with, is actually one of robustness and great great resources. But we should not mistakenly think that the politicians or the private sector or the public sector or whoever will come to us for advice. We need to, and I'm so sorry to say that, we need to make ourselves available for the political sector, if you want a public sector, right? So we need to go out there and say, why is culture important in defining at this point, I guess you can say resurrection of public space in London, right? Because there's like no agenda on public space whatsoever in this city. It's because it's been privatized and so on and so forth.
Hang on, we have royal parks, which you can't build them. We have 5 royal parks that are...
Yes, okay, well, fair enough. I'm generalizing a little bit just to make a statement. No, but I'm serious. I mean, it's also about, where does good space come from? I think, I'm not trying to bash the private sector and the investors, but I think a strong public-driven agenda in shaping a city, urban planning, city planning, blah. So all this sort of planning is based on values. Private sector is driven by money. So you need a healthy balance. I'm trying to be not too, I'm trying to be collaborative here. So you need the investors, but you also need, a city government who actually has architectural specialists from within who advise the city on what does the street we are building actually do to host two people who are disagreeing and still making that into a success? Why should that only be in the museum or here, up in the exhibition, where we can see, oh, I like that constable, and then the next chapter saying, oh, I like the turner. But these two people, maybe the disagreement is actually an amplifier of their friendship. It brings wealth into their relationship. Why could the street not be like that? Whereas we know very well, the street says, oh, I like, this street, I don't like it. Oh, if you don't like it, you should leave. Get out of Britain. Get out of the EU if you don't like it. So do you see, we have this kind of we're gradually accepting the polarization of our society into all kind of populistic kind of agendas where the private sector is just given much too much space, including the free art fair and so on as well, right? It's private sector.
You obviously have to, and you haven't said otherwise, engage with the private sector. You have to run a studio of, I think, 80 odd people. You are a successful artist commercially, although you're not. You always say you're not commercially driven, but I'd imagine you need to sell to fund the projects that you do. But I just want to talk about your studio generally. I mean, I came to your previous studio, which was large, impressive, next to the railway station. Now you have this vast studio. You've had a school there for 5 years that's now finished. You've set up an architectural office. You have a daily food lunch that we've read about recently where you published a cookbook. I mean, this is extraordinarily impressive and range of activity. But I'm curious as to how you, on a day-to-day basis, act in that studio. You must be I was going to say managing director, but are you the kind of creative director who wanders around from department to department? Do you have a rhythm where you sit quietly for an hour to generate ideas? Do you work very closely in the manner of an architect? How do you work?
Yeah, it's a good question. It also is evolving somehow. It's not like I have one formula, and it's very project-driven, so that the projects typically outside of the studio very often create the demands around which the studio organizes itself. So I think that's a kind of central thing. There is a common, or I hope there is a common understanding in the studio. There is nothing more important than art, and every decision obeys to this rule. So this means, and this might sound a little, hierarchical, but it is hierarchical. There is nothing more important than art. But then again, the pragmatics of that is that I've given away the management of the studio to some people who are more talented. I did it. And then I realized, oh, bloody hell, somebody else can do it better than me. And then it became better. Also, the money management I gave away. Oh, then I started to actually make a little money. And gradually, there's no reason not to say it's also sometimes difficult. But on a good day, I'm really only involved with creativity. And then again, creativity can be everywhere, right? So it's not like I'm only doing sketches or something. But fundamentally, I'm in a very fortunate situation where there is a long culture in the studio where people carry a lot of the burden for me, and with almost no payment also. So I'm very thankful. It's quite incredible. My studio would never work in London.
Because?
It just wouldn't, right? I don't know, but people get... maybe it would. Maybe I'm wrong. I should be. But I'm just saying, maybe it's just in my head, but I somehow have a feeling... So...
just for those that don't know, your studio's in Berlin. Is Berlin, in a sense... is your studio a microcosm or a very strong reflection of Berlin? This city that's very strongly located, but at the same time, it's a place of transition. There's people from all over Europe come to Berlin. It has a great emerging creative life. It's seen as a fundamentally non-commercial city in comparison with many others. Is that something that appeals to you, or are there more practical reasons?
Thank you. Yeah, it's good that you say it. And also, I'm so sorry for being so, taking for granted, So I have 100 people about, and there's like 26 nations we counted. You always know around Christmas how many people there are because we make a little Christmas present, and it's a very sort of robust system because we feed everybody with good food, and that keeps people healthy and committed. So we actually try to show people that, or I try to show people that we treasure them, and the sense of collective responsibility is very high. There's 3 departments, good to give you some numbers, each roughly the same size. One is a group of architects, one is a group of craftsmen, and one is a group of more academic sort of researchers who does great books like The Unspoken Spaces. It's like really a product out of me and the studio working for 5 or 6 or 7 years on something. And this gives you then 100 people. Yeah, it's interesting, right? It's interesting. And, so every department has a few people who are running it, one in particular, and I keep in contact with maybe 10 or 12 or 14 people, and we work slow. We work on very high quality. We look carefully at the money. We have great gallerists who have worked a long time with us, 20 years, in the kind of non-conspicuous end of the art market. Not to say that I'm not trying to also grab some of that money passing through Frieze Art Fair, but essentially, I think we have a robust, and I don't mean to bore you with this, but frankly speaking, I work a lot also with local governments, mayor's offices, regional governments, land, the North Rhine-Westphalen in Germany is like a land. It's a land in the country, Germany. And then you meet with the sort of local politicians, and we have a mini, I made a little sculpture for a German city, and then all the politician cultural heads that came, and then they did a vote in my studio, and I was so honored to be a little parliament. Like for one afternoon, we treasured. So it's like democracy in the making, right? So it's like kind of, if the artist studio could not host that totally not private sector, and there was that guy from the Green Party who thought it was rubbish. And what is the strength if not telling that chap, saying, listen, you're still welcome, right? We understand. I totally understand. I disagree, but you are still welcome. That's what we want the museums to say. Oh, you don't get it, do you? You're still welcome. We want you to be here.
This is also a very British question, because we're quite obsessed with national identity here. But given that your childhood, Iceland and Denmark, and you now live in Berlin, but you also go back to Copenhagen a lot at the weekends, or you commute sometimes. Have you always had a more fluid attitude to national identity?
Well, I think I take it very serious, but I still feel, I grew up in Denmark being Icelandic, and then when I went to Iceland, I was kind of Danish, so it's like kind of, I'm like a Turk in Germany. So the thing is, as we have learned from great people, it's really about who can, like great people, and I'll mention a great person in a second. It's really about how do you then verbalize that emotional, yet not verbalized condition of belonging, right? So here I am. I've been 20 years in Germany now. So, I had a great time in UK. That if it was like a watercolor, there's a bit of pigment right there from the UK, right? To talk so you get it right. But essentially, Dorian Massey, the great and late culture or economic geographer, who asked me to speak only, I think 2 or 3 years ago when she got some sort of award at the. So the last time I spoke here was at the, and I'm so honored to say it today, at the Royal Geography Society, just down the street, or like literally
across
next
the courtyard.
door. Yeah, it was amazing, right? So anyway, be in that with all these geographers, and I was then one. Here you have it, representative of the cultural sector. Not that they were not cultural, but I was like an artist. I was like an Englishman in New York, and essentially, what she taught us is that our identity is built up by the layers of stories through which we pass in life, which is really, I think, a very beautiful way of saying it, that I am a little bit, of every place and part and person that I have met. And that, I think, for me, constitutes who I am. And clearly that's a very relative size. It doesn't fit into the discussion about whether UK should be in EU or not. I'm totally lost there. Why on earth would you have that clumsy discussion when it's so obvious that we are Europeans and we should support that idea the way I see it, right? So interestingly, I'm very much afraid of... Oh, cheers. I'm very much afraid of the sort of decrease in we-ness if that's a word, like we, yeah, you and me,
Yes.
we, us too. So there seems to be a strong trend that the we's are getting smaller, and I'm being a cultural agent. I'm afraid of that concept of, at some point we have the sort of the populism has pushed we's into such small fractions where you have a lot of nationalism, xenophobia, homophobia, and things are getting so crunchy. And this is exactly where we talk about, well, why is it good to be in a room looking at a Constable painting and disagreeing, and then looking at that as an amplifier of our friendship? I say that because, that's something that I thought a lot about after doing the weather project right here at the Tate Modern a while ago, proposing the fact that, a museum should be and can be a forum where disagreement can be seen as an asset to the space. A disagreement, I mean, like kind of a shared experience without demanding the other person seeing the same.
Many of your works, quite a few of your works, have the word "your" in them. It's not "our," it's not "we," it's "your." That's curious, actually, in the light of what you just said. So, is that to detach you from that which you have created? It's
but it's. I became an artist in the early 90s, and I was a part of the optimists who left the kind of apocalyptic theory of the late French postmodern thinkers. And everything was, so I went to art school, everything is over. Baudrillard said, and Lyotard, and
History's over.
And obviously the Danes, being Protestant, they read it as like literally everything is over. But then again, I went to Germany on the day that the wall fell, because that was like 2 weeks after my art school, and that was like so positive. And luckily, I discovered then there was Deleuze, and there was like all these kind of crazy deconstructivists. Yeah, thanks. And then, so suddenly I got more self-confidence back. I said, oh, bloody hell, it's like being a dancer. Just go for it and live it all physically out, so to speak. But then again, I wanted, and one of my first works was a rainbow called Beauty. So that whole idea of calling it beauty, which is kind of tacky, right? But it was all about, well, let's say something is beautiful, instead of being so dreary and all about the end. And, there were great artists, Felix Gonzalez Torres. It was like so amazing, right? Katie Noland, very ugly, but really beautiful at the same time. So for me, very important people around that time. And of course the light and space people, James Turrell, Robert Irwin. So anyway, lots of confidence, but dematerializing everything, right? I remember right there, Lucy Lippard, the dematerialization of the objecthood of art, or whatever it's called.
Dematerialization of the art object, exactly.
Cheers. So the thing is, that's. I wanted to connect that long story with a question, which I now forgot. What was?
I think it was about identity. I think even I've forgotten what the question was.
Yeah, but no, but this is how now I get it. So the whole idea of giving the responsibility for finishing the narrative of the work and treasuring the viewer was the Rodin principle, right?
Yes.
So I'm just the humble servant, being the artist. I made the machine, but the machine being the artwork, so it's a tube and water sprinklers and so like, you are really the protagonist. So I was sort of obsessed with phenomenology at the time, and suggesting that, me being passive and the viewer being active was also an encouragement to art institutions to respect the visitors. Of course, the artists are kind of beyond, right? But still, the visitors are being treated as if they don't get it, which is a big mistake. They actually do get it. They just don't know how to say it, right? But that doesn't mean they don't get it. So I was very involved with questions of museology, display ideology. I was so interested in the consequences of putting a label and not putting a label, and all that stuff.
The Turbine, Tate Turbine Hall, the weather project, was in some ways a deconstruction of the museum. It also is an expansion of an already vast space. Phenomenologically, it seemed to double it. But it was often said, because we see things in certain ways over here, that it was British obsession with the weather, there's a Turnerian reference, and so on. And the sublime was often talked about in relationship to that piece. And I suppose looking at a lot of what you've done, and particularly the works that are referred to in this book, you could devise a kind of trope that says that that romantic notion of the sublime is something that has run through your work, and it's not unrelated to phenomenology. You know, people feel a physical, visceral sense of awe when they're confronted by things larger or more powerful than themselves. Is the sublime in that transcendental way something that distantly or openly interests you?
Yeah. No, but it's very interesting. I mean, I think there is a number of sort of theoretical trajectories, and I'm not a theoretical person, so I'm always mixing them up. But you know, so the sublime can mean. So in my world, I just split between two to keep it simple. So there's the kind of more totalitarian sublime. Everybody see the same, or if not, out of here. Yeah. And then there's the kind of more, let's say, the decentralized type of sublime where everybody sees something unique and this is important and so on. So of course, that's the one I subscribe to. But I mean, I know it's a little more complex, but we also have to understand, even though, I mean, I don't want to pragmatize or functionalize or take away the depth of a strongly spiritual experience. But I also think it's very important to understand that spirituality must be seen from within individuality and not as a kind of
coercive system.
Well, let's say like God or something, right? So in that sense, I'm actually very interested in the sublime. But the word in Germany, in particular, you know, sublime actually means, if you don't get it, you're not as good as me, and that's why it's a little complex talking about it. I am working on a project right now, and should you be going to Paris this summer, I have an exhibition at the Versailles this summer, as your fellow countryman had last summer, Anish. And one of the projects there, and that's an interesting house, right? Because unlike Tate Modern, who's really just like, you know, compared to Versailles, a few days old. So Versailles went from a very patriarchic, hierarchical, being a royal castle, like all Baroque and so on, and clearly quite impressive one, but all organized about power. Funny enough, Tate Modern is also a power station.
Yeah.
Anyway, but then France, as we know, went through that process of becoming a republic. And that was very courageous. You know, they had a revolution, and you know, that really changed society, and they have nurtured democracy in a very academic and, you know, scholarly manner, which has inspired and fueled Europe, also in education and like really robustly. So Versailles is interesting because, according to Doreen Massey, Versailles is not a visit which brings you back to Louis XIV. Versailles is on the move. And we are moving from London to Paris with the train, and we are meeting up with Versailles. That's an interesting concept, because as after the French terror attacks, the change of the French constitution to kind of deal with the new terror situation was then made at the Versailles. So the Versailles is also a contemporary castle. And the point here is it went through the process of decentralization. You could call it deconstruction, but essentially now Versailles is the house where everybody can become a queen or a king. Right? It's very interesting. It's not just for the one king. It has become the place where we can all experience that. And for me, the Tate Modern was about that same type of decentralization is not the right word, but really expressing the confidence in the worthwhile of civic society being capable of actually producing something themselves. My God, my son at the Tate Modern was just smoke and mirrors, right? Boom, boom, bit of mirrors, a little bit of yellow light and some smoke. Like, I did it with a lot of care, but it was very much driven to the success by the people, who sort of finished the narrative. And the truth is, I did not anticipate or predict, or how could I, that this would become like that. So in a way, the Tate actually, I mean, in the way that art institutions in England in particular have that slight, so no offense, right? I don't take it personally, but it's like patternistic kind of system, art, right? Mm-hmm. So, and then suddenly, somehow, if one can reverse it, and I think we owe the credit for Nick to at least trying, hiring crazy people like Chris Derkon, who's now just nurturing, what does it mean to actually have a bloody public space in the heart of a city which is just being so aggressively driven into places like your former job, Tim. So in that sense, I think...
What, the BBC? That's shocking, actually. What can you mean?
No, but so I think this is such interesting and important discussions. And right at the heart of that, of course, there is art, right? And how does the art deal with it?
It is interesting that you couldn't foresee, I don't think any of us at the time foresaw the public response to the Weather Project. I mean, in a sense, people wrote about it in the press as a kind of sociological moment where British people in galleries gave up their traditional reserve and started, I mean, people were lying on the floor, they were smoking in days where you could smoke in public arenas, they had picnics, there was a kind of staying through the night permitted and so on. It seems a kind of loosening up. Do you feel that it started to change things though? Do you feel, have you seen subsequently, I'm not just asking you in London, but did you feel that piece was part of a broader momentum in your work where you do... it's a very difficult question to ask you because you have to give the modest answer and go, no, I don't think I've changed anything. But do you feel that there's momentum underway that piece was a part of?
Yeah, also would be sad if I said no, right? So I would like to... But in various ways, yes, because since then I knew Herzog de Mont quite well, especially Jacques Herzog. And, I still celebrate my relationships with a lot of architects, and for them, the success of that work somehow became productive. So that's kind of one trajectory. In museology and in the idea that, programming the communicational muscle should allow for unpredictable measures and this idea of the forum, yes, I would like to see that I, if not created, then at least contributed to a kind of trajectory where museum became more confident in this idea of where we can be a city parliament. We don't have, the same system, but we are actually worth something. We are, good enough. The truth is sort of anecdotal. The reason why people who go to museums think that they are not good enough to look at art, they go like, oh, and they get quiet. It's because the museum thinks they're not good enough, right? And that's because, they don't listen to the artist. No, that was not the end. But you see, so the thing is, if a museum has self-confidence, then the visitor has self-confidence. I mean, I think there's something in that which is very important. But there was an anecdote. And then, of course, I also think that we should not, being artists, being afraid of bold statements. And of course, it takes a lot of risk. You have to see, I did not know what the Weather Project looked like before I did it. I couldn't test it, right? I couldn't put it up in my studio. It's not like a painter. No offense, but you sort of look at the painting and say, no, I'm not going to show that. And that's a luxury, right? I don't know what I'm showing at Versailles. You will see it the same time as I.
Waterfall, we've heard.
Oh, Tim, thank you. Yes,
My
indeed.
gift
No, it's true, yeah. So, yeah, actually...
Let me ask you to make a bold statement, or otherwise, about architects, because you have worked closely with many. But Harper, the concert hall and conference centre in Reykjavik, with Henning Larsson, you work collaboratively, but there's been a lot of collaboration between artists and architects, but I think it's usually agreed that art becomes a kind of embellishment. It reluctantly becomes... It moves towards the centre, but never is seen as an equal collaborator. But it seems pretty clear, unless you're going to contradict me, that with Harper, you were at least an equal partner, if not the dominant partner. I
would like to think so, yeah. I would also, I don't mind being the dominant one also. No, I'm serious. I mean, I think, again...
So what can artists and architects, how should they learn? Is architecture too dominant? Is it too arrogant?
No, but I think, first of all, we as artists need to also... Should one wish to actually work within that type of spatial activity, one needs to also be ready for the kind of conversations and battles that entails. Because talking to an architect, is a kind of special language. And after working, at Harper and a few other large-scale projects, I realized that I respect my participants at the studio so much that I'm going to form an architectural firm within my studio. So the person who was sort of the director of 15 years of architectural projects now is my partner in a kind of mini studio in the studio, which has the legal status of actually fulfilling the regulations, in this case German regulations, to actually bid on a competition. So should anybody be interested in, not skip the competition, just ask me directly. I actually have an architectural firm. So for me it's interesting both to be able to sort of participate in eye level with architectural firms, but also to say, well, there are discussions and solutions which the architects makes where I'm not as good as them. So out of respect, I partnered with a group, I made an architectural firm. But getting back to your question, at Harper, what is unique is that, and that's a nice advice, so the architects and the engineers have already had columns holding the roof and said, why don't you put some fancy art around that structure so that we win the bloody competition? And they asked me, so there was a competition. This nobody knows. I'll give you some good gossip. Anyway, the competition, 3 or 4 phases, right? Second phase, high scores, all accounts. One score is very low. It doesn't look good, right? And then the Icelandic Vikings, who were the ones who punished you, and I apologize on behalf of Iceland in this case. And the chap actually just lives down the road, right? That one guy with all that British thing. But anyway, Thor in his name. He's the guy who started Harper. But then Iceland crashed. It was amazing because suddenly all the gold handles, the parquet floors, all that sort of fancy nouveau-riche stuff became too expensive. The building site stopped, everybody went home, and it was like the monument of the financial crisis. And of course, Iceland was like the canary in the coal mine. So Britain, you were still doing really well, and Iceland was like horrible, and everybody was like, not knowing that it's going to hit everybody also. But so, interestingly, I said, I make my artwork carry the columns, and I recommend every artist to do the same. Take away the columns, give me the money, because the columns are more expensive than art. Right? I will hold the roof for you. And then gradually I just took more and more of the existing budget. We made it very modest, and it looks great. But it's actually, you kind of pay for what you get. There's no, it's very straightforward.
So these are the open quasi bricks.
Yes, and when they're kind of covered with glass, and there's a sort of thermo, whole weather system going on inside. So, but let me just finish the gossip part. Then it stood there, and then the Icelandic krona went right through the bottom, and suddenly it was too expensive to buy the steel from Poland and China and wherever it was coming from. And then the local Icelandic craftsmen, which is such a lovely story, said, the only place we can get work is doing the toilet handles and the kind of emergency signs at Harper. So slowly everybody in Iceland started to working on it, talking about nationalism, right? So anyway, and this was the only place to get work, so people they took ownership of it, said, let's finish our building, right? That whole thing that was started went from private hands into public hands, and it became a kind of collectivity project, which really still today, if you go to a concert and you listen to the violins, you can hear in that pitch of the tone, this is our building. I'm totally serious. And this is how the success of the building, the design actually is not, there's a nice facade and so on, but it's actually in the sound of the violin, because this is people who really strongly believe that this represents something in their society which kind of goes beyond, architecture.
Before I throw you out to the floor, which I've got to do because time's running out, I just want to ask you a brief question about legacy, because when you're asked about the creation of monuments, I think you've often quite vehemently said that's not what you're in the business of making, but I suppose one could say that even deconstructing the monument is in itself a form of monument. Harper has to be, whether you intended it or not, a kind of legacy. As you approach mid-career, have you started to think more about the notion of legacy? I don't mean necessarily what you are going to leave, but the traces that might get left behind and the impacts that you might make.
Well, I actually started looking at the luck that I had working with great people, with my great gallerists, with great talents, curators, museum directors, city mayors, people who took risks at times when I was much less exposed, and also literally money out the window between us. So, so in a way I've been very fortunate being surrounded by great people, to be very honest. And I thought about how could I make that bit of muscle or network, working with mayors and private sector protagonists like wealthy people. Could I use that combined with my creativity in some other way? So should you ask about legacy, I hope to achieve something which kind of reaches a little bit outside of the normal regime of the art world. Of course, that could be in education, which I enjoy and treasure a lot. But I've done this project, which I so happen to have right here in front of me. And that is, if you ask me, an art project. But next week I will be in Kigali, Rwanda, at the World Economic Forum, Africa. And imagine what liberty it is for me to say, listen to me, I look at the person and I go, so I go like, should I say I'm an artist, or should I say I'm in the energy sector? And that is the sustainable part of it, right? So this is a project which I think, being an artist allowed me to do, but it's a project that lives to a great extent outside of the art world. And I mean, I talk so much about it all the time, so I hope I'm not boring you. But luckily enough, this is like a gossiping thing. So the London Olympics asked me to do something, and I've signed, I won't speak about it, so I won't say much. But essentially, they had given me the money already. And Nick, bless him, Sirota, said, why don't you spend that money at our museum? And I say, yes, Nick, I will, but I will do something which is for the benefit of the people who are not at the Olympics, right? So, and that's how this actually started. So it kind of grew out of this, and it goes to your credit for having, indirectly made it possible. This is a solar panel, right? So you charge it like this. And then there is a rechargeable battery inside, and this is the light that you get from it. And this is the dimmable edition, right? So how nice is that? You hold it in and see? So what it does, it competes with the petroleum or kerosene, call it the fossil fuel sector. So here I am single-handedly with a group of 20 amazing people in Berlin and a co-founder who's a solar scientist trying to muscle down BP or whoever is in the petroleum, right? So let's just have a look at that. See, now I could go on for a long time. But anyway, just quickly, right? Very quickly. So, okay, one night of this, right? One night. Compared to a kerosene lantern, which is a single wick oil canister, right? Let's say 50 centiliter. That's roughly one night, right? Half a liter, full night, right? And then you have, of course, all the respiratory diseases and so on, so polluting climate, like unbelievably, very bad to read also and so on. Let's say 1 month, what's that, 30 days, that's 15 liter of petroleum. So 1 year, so that was 150 liter. Now we take 10 of these, that's a ton of petroleum, 10 in 1 year. And so it's actually a lot, right? So now we take 1 million. So now it gets complicated. So anyway, so 1 million, and I'm not saying, but we are in June reaching 500,000 sold. And you don't have to actually succeed a lot in scale, considering that, for instance, in Ethiopia, there are 16 million children in between 6 and 14 without access to energy. 16 million. Like, let's imagine somebody gave them all, or if they all bought one. That is 11 super tankers of oil going to Ethiopia. That's how much it is, right? So this little project is actually a very big project. And the way we do it is we sell it with a profit, for instance, online or here at the Tate or at the Serpentine and so on and so forth. And we've done so for quite a while. And that profit then drives it into micro businesses, sort of circular economy systems and, in social entrepreneuring. And so we don't believe in giving things away, which, of course, is kind of harder than you think. But, nevertheless, the point is talking about, can we take what we know from the art world and then use it and make it actually translatable, or almost like, the way you translate currency? Can you use that muscle in other ways? And I think it's up to us from the cultural sector, whether we are artists or museum or writers or whatever, to see what can we actually do. And I'm not necessarily saying it has to be a social thing, but if we are not to expand the cultural sphere, who will? I mean, certainly not the politicians or the private sector. They would want to decrease the size of it. So in that sense, just like as a little sort of commercial add-on, this is the mobile phone charger. So should you be down at, where do you go, right, in the summer? Cornwall, on the beach, palm trees, and then you go, oh, bloody hell, my phone is dead. And I say, luckily Olafur made this incredible solar mobile phone charger, which is very cheap. So that's soon, 2 or 3 weeks, you'll buy that too. But you see what I'm saying? So I think it's very interesting to see, could I, just like the book, The Unspoken Spaces here, is very much about the projects which are not in the museum catalogs, are not in the gallery shows, are not, the projects which are living out there on the street, where people, who are not necessarily going to go to the museum actually pass by. This is where I would like to see my, not me, but my impact. Whether people know that it's from me doesn't really matter, frankly.
Beautiful answer. Let me, and a nice riff on the notion of legacy and monument on such a small scale, but making a big difference. Questions from the floor. We've got about 7 minutes as we started at 22. I think there's microphones. Hands up.
I don't need a microphone. Do you believe that you are now part of a collective consciousness in this present generation? Because I'm having the same thoughts as you are. I'm talking to people who are having the same thoughts as you are in different countries. You must be doing the same thing. And from the beginnings in the early 1990s, when these were new ideas, in 2016, do you not feel that you are part of something that's going on in the world at the moment, way beyond yourself?
Oh, absolutely. I think I'm a part of, there are discursive, discourses in theory, and, on a good day, I'm a little kind of upfront, but generally speaking, I'm just, one of the people moving further. There's like young artists right up front pushing the hard work, and I'm just comfortably sailing right behind them. So no, I'm quite serious. There are, for instance, so you have your friends. I grew up with a group of artists who are roughly my age. That's one part. So you go to a pub with them, you kind of don't say anything in particular, but you already had a huge discussion because you don't have to say everything, right? So you're so close. But you also have situations where you have thinkers, so Timothy Morton, object-oriented ontology, and I just, I'm not a specialist in that, but it's like, it's almost as if he's saying something that you already contain emotionally, you just haven't gotten around to actually express it. And why would he know what you felt? And he's in, he's in, like, I think in St. Louis at the Rice University, or, it's like crazy. He is so talking about what I was trying to achieve putting ice blocks in Paris. So he's a great, go to his blog, what is it called? Who knows Timothy Morton's excellent blog?
He's referenced in your book, isn't he?
Yeah, oh yeah, cheers.
And we're going to do a sign so you can get the book afterwards. We'll do that.
Yeah, but so I like that idea. We are not alone. It's a good title for a book.
Very good. I think someone's coined it, but yeah. Eliza.
I will wait for more.
It's just coming behind you.
Hi, thank you for some really interesting thoughts. We are, of course, at the Royal Academy an art school, and I know in the past few years you have sort of worked with younger artists in a form, and I wondered if you could say something about that experiment and what you were aiming to do and how that went.
Yeah, big topic. I was lucky to be given a 5-year grant from the Ministry of Science in Germany to expand on a satellite type of note, the art school, the academy, the UDK, Universität der Kunst in Berlin. So within the public realm of the university, I propose to run an art school within my studio, but still totally not making the participants, the students, work at my studio or in any way. They came to eat as a sign, and we did with my studio team. And I think it tells a little bit. I advised all my studio participants, students. So the workers, I told, if you see a student pass by, always be prepared to hug them. Oh. Because, being a student is bloody hard. And if you don't get a hug every once in a while, so...
That used to go on at the Royal Academy schools, but they've stopped it now, actually.
And the point is so I'm very interested in teaching methodology or art school, pedagogic methodology. The point was, and this is not really so unique, but the point was to try to allow the participants to express their not yet verbalized emotional need, I think I said before, and then I would try to mirror that. So I would not really, I'm sorry to make it sound so simple, but if one could essentially reflect the part of them which has not been met in order for them to evolve, instead of me imposing my gossip on them, right? So I would very rarely, except when criticizing the art world, talk about my experiences. I would much more encourage them to be confident, just like when my mother did not say anything to me, in particular when I was like a robot. And that came out of, I went to an art school in Denmark, which very quickly prompted me to leave. So I didn't, I took the school money, I stayed close enough to get school money.
This was the Royal Academy of Fine Arts.
Another bloody Royal Academy, yes. And now it's a great school. I mean, like much after. But within that, it actually filters down in a lot of real pragmatic exercises and actual real work. So we had a lot of natural sciences, social sciences, compassion-based sciences, so spiritual sciences. We had exercises which were about embodiment, about breath. We had laughter therapy. We had cooking courses, tofu courses, food activists throwing food at politicians, going to politicians. We had grants given to politicians, so the politicians were in the school. We were trying to get grants for the students being in the parliament, did not work. So we had cultural geographers. We had arts, a lot of protagonists from the periphery of the art world participate. We had little money, but we made a lot of the little funding we had. I had a poet / trained architect being a co-teacher, and a political scientist / curatorially trained person being a co-teacher. So there was 2 daily teachers. We had lectures 4 days. We had program 4 days a week, lectures 3 days a week. We tried to muscle in 20 years of education in a 5-year program to really prepare people to the kind of hard work that being an artist actually is. So we worked very hard, and should you have time, you can actually see the whole bloody 5 years is recorded on an archival homepage, including all the rubbish, right? So, and it's called IFREX, Institut für Raumexperimente. So IFREX is funny, it's like IFREX.net, I guess, right, nowadays. Org, maybe net. Go to my homepage, you'll find it there as well. So anyway, and there's, the great Doran Massey, Bruno Latour, lots of people from England coming over, lots of artists too, lots of workshops, teaching on the street.
The Royal Academy is a pluralistic organisation. I mean, it is made up of many different kinds of artists and architects, but we still have, because of our foundation 248 years ago, categories. So artists and architects join as architects. Artists must join as sculptors, painters, or printmakers, but they're fluid categories. You, though, have been elected as an honorary academician, just to repeat it, honorary academician. So that means you can be elected as a fully functioning, pluralistic artist, because it would be impossible, on the evidence of what we've seen tonight, to categorise you in any shape or form. You are just, in the most profound sense of the word, an artist. So before we end the formal part of the evening, and then ask you to go and sign some books, with great thanks to Thames and Hudson, and it is a wonderful book. I'd like to invite the President of the Royal Academy, Christopher Lebrun, to come and make a presentation to you. Christopher.
Christopher.
The more Oliver talked about deconstruction and the death of kings and Versailles and the revolution, the more I felt enormously conscious. I'm wearing an enormous gold medal with the head of George IV. The Royal Academy is a place of paradox, of course. As artists, we're a place where we're paradoxical, we can combine things. The General Assembly, about a month ago, met, and we're in the position of being able to elect any artist from around the world to become an honorary academician. Any artist. And we elected Oliver.
Well, thank you. Thanks.
And I appear to be about to be giving him a red tube, which must be deeply disappointing.
No, I'm so excited.
But inside it is an engraving by Bartolozzi, one of the very first academicians in 1769, who was Italian. And we're delighted to have you as part of the Royal Academy.
It's a great honor for me.
Thank you, Oliver.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Olafur Eliasson. Thank you, Olafur.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.